The year is 44 before Christ, before Pompeii, before the burning of Rome, before the empire itself. 123 years before a mountain in southern Italy would bury a city in ash. 108 years before a fire would destroy the wooden tenements of the imperial capital. 114 years before a young emperor named Nero would be born in a country villa and grow up to be remembered for crimes he probably did not commit. In the year 44 before Christ, none of this had happened yet. Rome was not yet an empire. Rome was a republic, and had been a republic for nearly 500 years. Power was held not by a single ruler, but by an elected senate of 300 wealthy men, supported by 2 consuls who served 1-year terms and were chosen by the citizens of Rome. The system was old. It was complicated. It was in many places corrupt. But it had survived for half a millennium, and most Romans believed it would survive forever. In the year 44 before Christ, the system was about to break. Pause. There was a man at the center of everything. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was 55 years old. He was tall and balding and pale. He suffered occasionally from what his biographer Suetonius called the falling sickness, what we today might call epilepsy, or perhaps something else, no one is entirely sure. He was vain about his thinning hair. He combed it forward to hide the bald spot. He wore a laurel wreath when he could justify one, partly because it suggested honor, and partly because it covered his head. He was, by any measure, the most successful Roman who had ever lived. He had conquered Gaul, modern France, in a series of brilliant and brutal campaigns. He had crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion and started a civil war. He had defeated his great rival, Pompey the Great, on the plains of Greece. He had pursued Pompey to Egypt, where Pompey was murdered by his hosts before Caesar could even reach him. He had met Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt, who became his lover and bore him a son. He had crushed the last loyalists of Pompey in Africa and Spain. He had returned to Rome in triumph 4 times over in a single year. And then he had done the thing that the Roman Senate could never forgive. He had declared himself dictator, not for a year, not for the duration of a crisis, not for any traditional Roman reason. He had declared himself dictator for life. Pause. Tonight we travel to a single morning, the morning of the 15th of March, in the year 44 before Christ, the day the Romans called the Ides of March. It is a story you may already know, in fragments, a warning from a soothsayer, a wife's terrible dream, a famous last phrase, in Latin, which Caesar almost certainly never said. To understand why Caesar had to die, or why 50 senators believed he had to die, we must first understand what he had become. In the Roman Republic, the dictator was an emergency office. When the city faced a threat that could not be managed by the regular machinery of the state, the Senate could appoint a single man to hold absolute power for a limited time, usually 6 months, never longer. The dictator could raise armies. He could levy taxes. He could execute citizens without trial. And then when the crisis was over, he was expected to step down, to return to private life, to bow quietly to the system that had given him such enormous temporary authority. The most famous dictator in early Roman history was a man named Cincinnatus. He was a farmer. The Senate appointed him dictator during a war with neighboring tribes. He won the war in 15 days. Then he resigned. Then he went back to his farm. He was remembered for centuries as the model of Roman virtue, the man who held absolute power and walked away from it. Caesar did not walk away. He had first been appointed dictator in the year 49 at the start of his civil war with Pompey. The appointment had lasted only 11 days. He used the time to manage food shortages in the city. He stepped down. He returned to the war. He was appointed dictator a second time in 48, then a third time in 46, this time for a 10-year term. The Senate, now full of his supporters, granted him this unusual length out of gratitude for his victories. It was already, by Roman standards, scandalous. But Caesar accepted. Then, in the early weeks of 44, perhaps in February, perhaps in early March, the Senate did something unprecedented in 500 years of Roman history. They voted to make Caesar dictator for life. Dictator perpetuo, dictator forever. A man who would never step down, a man whose power would end only with his death. Caesar accepted, and in accepting he made enemies. Some of his enemies were the old guard of the Roman aristocracy, men who had loved Pompey, who had lost wealth and status when Caesar won the civil war, who had been pardoned, but who had never forgiven him. These men hated him for what he had done to their world. But others, and this is the strange and tragic thing, were Caesar's own supporters. Men he had pardoned, men he had promoted, men who owed him their lives and their fortunes and the high offices they now held. These were the idealists. They had supported Caesar in the Civil War because they believed he would restore the Republic. They believed that when the war was over, Caesar would step down. He would resume his rightful role as a senator among senators. He would return Rome to its ancient form. When he did not, when instead he became dictator for life, they began to feel that they had been deceived, that their loyalty had been used, that the man they had followed was not a savior of the Republic, but a destroyer of it. Among these idealists was a man named Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was Caesar's protege. He was 40 years old in 44, 15 years younger than Caesar. His mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's mistress for nearly 20 years, on and off, since long before Brutus was born. Some Romans, the conspiracy began, as conspiracies do, in private rooms, small groups of senators, hushed voices, wine, but not too much. Doors closed, servants sent away, a single oil lamp burning on a low table. The first to talk seriously of killing Caesar was probably a man named Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius was Brutus's brother-in-law. He was older, sharper, more bitter than Brutus. He had also fought against Caesar in the Civil War, and had also been pardoned, and had also been promoted. But Cassius had not forgiven. He could not forgive. He watched Caesar's growing power with a cold, calculating fury, and he began sometime in late 45 to plan. He needed allies. He needed names. He needed men whose participation in the plot would give it legitimacy, would convince the watching world that this was not the act of bitter old enemies, but the act of true Roman patriots defending the Republic. Above all, he needed Brutus, because Brutus had something none of the other conspirators had. Brutus had Caesar's love. Brutus was Caesar's friend, his protege, his almost son. If Brutus joined the plot, the assassination would not look like betrayal by enemies. It would look like the desperate act of even Caesar's closest allies. It would carry, in the eyes of Rome, a terrible kind of moral weight. Cassius slowly, carefully, began to bring Brutus into the plan. We do not know exactly when Brutus agreed. We know only that by the early months of 44, he had. The conspirators began to grow in number. 10, 20, 40. Eventually, by some ancient accounts, more than 60 men were in on the plot. They debated, in those private rooms, exactly when and where it should be done. Some wanted to do it at the elections, when Caesar would summon the tribes of Rome to vote. They could throw him from the bridge, the temporary wooden bridge over which the voters passed one by one to cast their ballots, and the rest could wait below to finish him. Others wanted to do it on the Sacred Way, the main road through the Roman Forum, where Caesar walked daily. Others wanted to do it at the entrance to the theater, when Caesar was distracted by a performance. In the end, they chose a different place. A meeting of the Senate had been called for the 15th of March, the Ides, at the Hall of Pompey. This was not the usual meeting place of the Senate. The usual Senate house in the Forum had been damaged in earlier civil wars and was being rebuilt. So the senators that year had been meeting in a building constructed by Pompey himself, a great colonnaded portico attached to the theater Pompey had built on the field of Mars. The conspirators chose this place for a reason. In the entrance hall of the building, on a tall stone pedestal, stood a great marble statue, a statue of Pompey the Great, the man Caesar had defeated in the Civil War, the man whose memory still divided Rome. Caesar would die at the foot of his old enemy's statue. There was poetry in this. There was also danger. The conspirators knew that if anything went wrong, they would all be executed. Their families would be destroyed. Their estates would... The Romans believed in omens. To us, 2,000 years later, this can seem strange. We do not, most of us, scan the flight of birds for messages from the gods. We do not interpret the entrails of sacrificial animals. We do not believe that the future writes itself in faint signs in the days before great events. But to the Romans, this was simply the texture of life. The world was full of meaning. The gods spoke through animals, through dreams, through the weather, through the smallest accidents and coincidences. A wise man learned to read these signs. A foolish man ignored them, and history, the Romans believed, was full of great men who had ignored the warnings and paid the price. In the days before the Ides of March, the warnings came thick and strange. The first came from a man named Spurinna. Spurinna was a haruspex, a priest who divined the will of the gods by reading the entrails of sacrificed animals. He was an Etruscan of an ancient people who had been in Italy long before Rome. He was, by reputation, one of the most respected diviners in the city. A month before the Ides, perhaps in early February, Spurinna had been performing a sacrifice in Caesar's presence. The animal had been opened. Its organs had been examined, and Spurinna had looked up, troubled and warned Caesar that great danger lay ahead. He gave a date. He said the danger would come no later than the Ides of March. Caesar had laughed. He laughed not because he disbelieved Spurinna. He was a Roman after all, and Romans took such things seriously. But because Spurinna had been imprecise. The Ides of March were 30 days away. Anything could happen in 30 days. The omen was too vague to act on. He thanked the priest. He continued with his day. But he did not forget. Other signs came in the following weeks. In the city, the herds of wild horses that Caesar had dedicated to the gods, horses he had set free after crossing the Rubicon 6 years earlier, as a thank offering, began to behave strangely. They refused to graze. Their keepers reported that the horses wept. Tears, the men said, ran down their faces. In a small grove on the Capitoline Hill, a little bird called the kingbird flew into the hall of Pompey carrying a sprig of laurel. The kingbird was a small, harmless creature. The laurel was the plant of victory, the plant Caesar had worn on his head for years. But as soon as the bird entered the hall, a flock of larger birds, vultures, hawks, ravens, descended from the surrounding trees and tore the kingbird to pieces, scattering its feathers and the broken laurel across the marble floor. In the city, a tablet on the statue of one of the founding fathers of Rome was found, overnight, to bear a new inscription. The Latin was rough, the work of an unknown hand, but the meaning was clear. Would that you were alive, Brutus, the inscription. On the night of the 14th of March, Caesar dined with friends. The host was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, one of his most loyal supporters, a man who had served under him in Gaul, a man Caesar trusted with the highest offices in Rome. The dinner was small, perhaps a dozen guests. Wine was served. Conversation, by the standards of late Republican Rome, was light. At some point during the evening, the conversation turned, as it sometimes did, to philosophy. The men began to discuss death. Not anyone's death in particular, but the question itself. What kind of death was best? What kind of death should a man wish for? The guests offered their answers. A peaceful death in old age, a death surrounded by family, a noble death in battle. Caesar, lying on his couch, listened. Then, after a while, he gave his own answer. The best kind of death, he said, was a sudden one, unforeseen, unexpected, done before you could feel afraid of it, done before you could resist it. Done, if possible, in a single moment. The guests laughed. They drank to it. They moved on to other subjects. The next morning, Caesar would receive the death he had described. He went home late. His wife, Calpurnia, was already in bed. Calpurnia was Caesar's third wife. She was perhaps 35 years old and 44, 20 years younger than her husband. She was the daughter of a senator. She had no children. She was, by all accounts, devoted to Caesar. She had stood by him through the Civil War, through his long absences, through the affair with Cleopatra, who was at this very moment living in a villa Caesar had given her on the right bank of the Tiber, just outside the city walls. Calpurnia was not a complaining wife. She did not interfere in her husband's politics. She did not ask for things. But on the night of the 14th of March, Calpurnia had a dream. The accounts of the dream differ. Suetonius says she dreamed that the pediment of their house collapsed. the great triangular sculpture above the front door, granted to Caesar by the Senate as an honor. She dreamed it fell, and that her husband was stabbed in her arms. Plutarch says she dreamed that she held Caesar's bloodied body. Cassius Dio says she dreamed simply of darkness, and a sound she could not identify, and then woke screaming. In all of the accounts, the door of the bedroom, by some prearranged accident, by some failure of the latch, flew open at the moment she woke. The cold air of the night came in. The single oil lamp on the table guttered. Calpurnia sat up in bed. She was trembling. She turned to her husband. She begged him not to go to the Senate the next morning. Caesar, half awake, was at first dismissive. He had had restless dreams himself throughout his life. He had learned to ignore them. He told her to go back to sleep, but Calpurnia would not let it go. She pressed him. She wept. She reminded him of the warnings, Spirina, the kingbird, the strange omens that had been gathering for weeks. She begged him, finally, to send a message in the morning, saying that he was unwell. The Senate would understand. They would meet without him. The morning of the 15th of March came, in Rome, with a thin gray light, the kind of light that promises rain by afternoon. Caesar woke late. He took breakfast in his bedroom. He prepared the message to the Senate. He explained, in a sentence, that he was unwell. He would not be coming today. A servant was about to take the message when a guest arrived. The guest was Decimus Junius Brutus. Now, this is important. There were two Brutuses in the conspiracy. Marcus Junius Brutus, the famous one, the one Shakespeare made the central figure, was Caesar's ward and almost son. But there was a second Brutus, a distant cousin, Decimus. And Decimus, like his more famous relative, had been a friend of Caesar's. He had served under Caesar in Gaul. He was one of Caesar's heirs, named in the will. Caesar trusted him completely. Decimus had also joined the conspiracy. When Decimus arrived at Caesar's house that morning, he learned what was happening. The message. Calpurnia's dream. Caesar's decision not to attend. Decimus knew immediately that the plot was in danger. If Caesar did not come to the Senate, the conspirators, 60 men gathered in the hall of Pompey with daggers hidden in their togas, would be exposed. The plot would be discovered. They would all die. So Decimus did what only a trusted friend could do. He persuaded Caesar to change his mind. He used flattery. He used reason. He used the gentle pressure of a man who has known another man for 20 years. The Senate has been waiting for hours, Decimus said. They will think you afraid. They will think a woman's dream has frightened the conqueror of Gaul. There is nothing to fear, my friend. The senators love you. They have prepared honors to vote on this very morning. To stay home now, for a dream would be to insult them. To shame yourself. Caesar listened. He looked at his wife. Calpurnia was silent now. She knew she had lost. Caesar nodded. He pushed back his chair. He called for his litter, the curtained chair, carried by slaves, in which wealthy Romans were transported through the streets. He prepared slowly to go. It was already the 5th hour of the day, about 10 in the morning by our reckoning. The Senate, indeed, had been waiting. He was carried through the streets of Rome, The litter swayed gently. The streets were busy. Romans paused as he passed, bowing, calling out his name. He passed Spurina in the crowd. The haruspex was standing on a corner, watching. He had been watching for Caesar all morning. He had known, by the omens of his sacrifices, that this was the day his warning had pointed to. Caesar, in good humor, called out to him cheerfully, "Well, Spurina, the Ides of March have come, and I am still alive." Spurina looked at him. The priest's face was grave. "Aye, the Ides have come," he said, "but they are not yet gone." Caesar laughed. The litter moved on. As he walked the final steps to the entrance of the Hall of Pompey, a man pressed through the crowd toward him. His name was Artemidorus. He was a Greek, a teacher of philosophy. He had heard of the plot somehow. A member of the conspiracy had spoken too freely in front of him, or perhaps a slave had overheard a conversation. Artemidorus had written down everything he knew, the names, the plan, the place. He entered the hall. The senators were waiting. They rose, as was the custom, when Caesar appeared. Some were genuinely glad to see him. Others, the conspirators, were terrified that he had nearly not come at all. Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul, his closest political ally, a man who would have fought to defend him, tried to enter alongside him. But one of the conspirators, by prearrangement, intercepted Antony at the door. He drew Antony into a long, urgent, meaningless conversation about some matter of provincial administration. Antony, polite, was held there. He could not get past. He could not enter. Caesar walked into the hall alone. He took his seat, a high gilded chair, set on a low platform at the front of the room. Around him, the conspirators began to gather. The first to approach was a senator named Tullius Cimber. Cimber held a petition. He asked Caesar with great formality to recall his exiled brother. It was a routine request. Other senators clustered around, ostensibly to support the petition, in fact to surround Caesar, to position themselves for the strikes that were coming. Caesar refused the petition. He had already considered it. He waved Cimber away. Cimber did not retreat. Instead, and this was the signal, he reached forward and grabbed Caesar's purple toga. He pulled it down. He pulled it off Caesar's neck. Caesar cried out in surprise and anger, "Why, this is violence!" It was the last full sentence he would speak. A senator behind him, Publius Servilius Casca, produced a dagger. He aimed for Caesar's throat. The blade glanced off. It cut the dictator's neck but did not pierce it. Casca, panicking, called out to his brother in Greek, "Brother, help me!" Caesar, blood running down his neck, twisted around. He saw Casca holding the dagger. He grabbed Casca's arm. He was, after all, a soldier, a man who had fought in many wars, who had killed many men. He was strong, even at 55. He may have hoped, in that first second, that this was a single attack, the work of one madman. Then he saw the others. He saw the daggers, drawn now, in the hands of senators all around him. Brutus among them, Cassius, Decimus, faces he knew, friends he had pardoned, men whose careers he had built. The realization, when it came, must have come fast. The blades came at him from every direction. Cassius slashed his face. Bucilianus stabbed his back. Decimus drove a dagger into his thigh. The assassins, in the frenzy, began to wound one another, clipping and cutting each other's hands as they stabbed. Caesar fought at first. He turned. He cried out. He raised his arms. The Roman historian Appian, writing later, said that Caesar turned from one to another of them with furious cries like a wild beast. But there were too many. 23 blades came down on him. 23 wounds were counted later on his body. Only one, the physicians would say, was fatal. The second one, to his ribs. He was bleeding heavily now. His vision was blurring. His legs would not hold him. Then he saw Brutus. Brutus, his almost son. Brutus, who he had pardoned, who he had loved. Brutus, with a dagger in his hand. What Caesar said in that moment, if he said anything at all, has been argued for 2,000 years. Suetonius and Cassius Dio say he died in silence, uttering not a single word. But others, they say, recorded that he spoke a single phrase, in Greek, the language Caesar often used when speaking privately to friends. Kai su, teknon, you too, child. Whether he said it or not, whether it was a question or a curse, or simply a sigh, we will never know. Shakespeare, the hall, in the moments after, fell into a strange kind of silence. The conspirators stood, breathing hard, blood on their hands and arms. The other senators, those who had not been part of the plot, who had only just realized what was happening, stared in horror. Brutus stepped forward. He raised his bloody dagger above his head. He had prepared a speech. He wanted to explain, to justify, to tell his fellow senators what they had done and why. He wanted to tell them that Rome was free now, that the tyrant was dead, that the republic had been saved. But the senators did not wait for the speech. They fled. They ran for the doors. They scattered into the field of Mars, through the streets of the city, back to their homes. Within minutes, the news was spreading through Rome. Caesar is dead. The senators have killed Caesar. The conspirators left the body where it lay. It was hours before anyone returned to the hall. By then, most of the city was in chaos. Shops were closed, houses were barred, rumors flew. Caesar's body lay alone on the marble floor for most of the afternoon. Eventually, 3 slaves, men of his household, came to retrieve it. They carried him home on a broken litter, with one arm dangling out from under the cloth. Calpurnia was waiting at the door. In the days that followed, Brutus and the conspirators tried to win over the city. They marched through the forum, declaring that Rome was free. They gave speeches. They issued statements. They expected perhaps to be cheered as liberators. They were not. The Roman people, it turned out, had loved Caesar. The poor had loved him because he had given them land. The middle class had loved him because he had given them a stable government. The soldiers had loved him because he had led them to victory and made them rich. The aristocracy had hated him. But the aristocracy was a few hundred men in a city of 1 million. The conspirators began to realize slowly that they had miscalculated. 3 days after the assassination, Caesar's funeral was held in the Forum. Mark Antony, the consul who had been kept out of the Senate hall by a long, careful conversation, gave the eulogy. He had recovered his composure. He had gathered his rage. He spoke of Caesar's victories, his generosity, his pardons. He read aloud Caesar's will. In the will, Caesar had left a substantial sum of money, 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen. The crowd, by this point, was in tears. By the time Antony finished speaking, they were a mob. They built a pyre in the Forum, on the spot where the temple of divine Julius would later stand. They burned Caesar's body in the open air. Then they took burning sticks from the pyre and ran through the streets of Rome, looking for the houses of the conspirators. The conspirators fled. Brutus and Cassius left the city. They went to Greece, where they began to raise an army. They told themselves that the Republic could still be saved. They told themselves that the Roman people, in time, would understand what they had done. They were wrong. 2.5 years later, in the autumn of 42 before Christ, Brutus and Cassius would stand on a battlefield in Greece, at a place called Philippi, facing an army led by Mark Antony and a young man named Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir. Cassius, in the chaos of the first day of fighting, would believe his army defeated and would order Octavian, the young man, just 19 years old, who Caesar had named in his will as his adopted son and heir, was in many ways the true winner of the Ides of March. He came to Rome in the weeks after the assassination, claiming his inheritance, claiming his name. Within 13 years, he would defeat all his rivals, including eventually Mark Antony, who would die in Egypt in the arms of Cleopatra. Within 15 years, he would be the master of Rome. And in the year 27 before Christ, 17 years after his great uncle was murdered, the Senate of Rome would grant Octavian a new name, Augustus, the Exalted One, the first emperor of Rome. The Republic had ended. The Empire had begun. The conspirators had killed Caesar to prevent a king. They had succeeded only in clearing the way for a dynasty. The very system they had feared most, one man ruling for life with absolute power, was the system that now took root and would last for the next 450 years. Caesar had been right. It was more important for Rome that he should survive. Without him, Rome had not enjoyed peace. It had endured 13 years of civil war. It had been remade in blood into a different kind of state. The Ides of March became, in Roman memory, a day of evil omen. For centuries afterward, Romans avoided important business on that date. They closed shops. They stayed home. They taught their children that, on this day long ago, a great man had been killed by his friends, and the world had changed. The phrase entered the language of Western culture. Beware the Ides of March. A warning that has outlived empires, religions, languages. A warning that today, 2,000 years later, can still be heard in poems, in plays, in films, in casual conversation. The Hall of Pompey, where Caesar died, was eventually walled up. Augustus considered the place cursed. The statue of Pompey, splattered with Caesar's blood, was moved. The senators were forbidden by imperial decree ever to meet there again. Today, the site of the assassination lies in the heart of modern Rome, in the area around the Largo di Torre Argentina, a sunken square in the center of the city. The ancient ruins are still there, partly excavated. You can stand on the cobblestones above and look down into the broken columns, and remember that on this exact spot, on a gray morning in March 2070 years ago, 23 blades came down on the most powerful man in the world, and history turned a corner from which it would never return. Cats live in the ruins now. They sleep on the warm stones in the afternoon sun. They have been there for centuries, fed by the Romans who pass, watched by tourists who pause, indifferent to the marble and the memory beneath them. It is late now. Close your eyes.